I feel thin, sort of stretched, like butter scraped over too much bread. I need a holiday.
In the chance that we read, in the dreams that your dreams lead to me, through the stars and the cosmic streams, to the realms where...
But when you were in Yes, it was this majestic, deep, macrobiotic band that they were, with these lyrics about, you know, who knew what, about Sanskrit books of the dead and stuff. Yeah. And I used to see your eyes closed in that big glitter cape, doing the mellotron and everything else. Yeah. But does that mean your heart and mind were not entirely in the concept of topographic oceans and stuff?
No, I must admit, Toby's graphic go-kart, as I used to lovingly call it, it was... I used to close my eyes a lot because most people eat after a show. I used to have violent curries beforehand.
But, you know, it was overblown rock, took itself seriously, and they were indulgent, and everything that went with 70s rock and roll. Yep. And yet, at the same time, as I said in the introduction, you're on Clive Dunn's Grandad, too.
I was on the full-up Grandma.
The way it happened actually was because we actually had nothing else to perform. So we go on tour and sing and play close to the edge to people in Germany or Sweden or England or whatever. And all of a sudden, people wanted to hear it. And then you record it, and then it comes out, and a beautiful artwork by the guy, I forgot his name. Terrible.
Roger Dean.
Roger Dean. I always call him Roger.
Imagine that you control a drone. The drone looks at that reality where it is, sends me information, and I get the conscious experience of what the drone is seeing. That conscious experience is not in my body, it's in my consciousness.
A scientific theory that basically states that our body is operated like a drone from a conscious quantum field, which would mean that experience, qualia, is not in your head.
The qualia do not exist in the body, they exist in the field.
Okay, people will find this crazy idea.
It is crazy, but it is much closer to the truth.
As I stand before you in front of this old Victorian mill, a symbol of not only the scientific progress that we see here in 19th century Britain, but also the vision of an industrialized country. in the northern parts of Great Britain, we see an industrialization of the landscape. And within that landscape, we behold a young musician, John Anderson, growing up in the north of England, in the industrialization that was apparent there. This generation that came to fruition in the 1960s wished to find another way of expressing themselves, of reaching out to more metaphysical ideas, more spiritual ideas. In the early 70s, we saw on British television an incredible television series called The Ascent of Man. It inspired me so much that I'm talking to you here now on this program, The Ascent of Prog. John Anderson saw this program too in the early 70s. And in this program, the great Dr. Jacob Bronowski attempted to give a coherent vision of the ascent of human beings into the civilized state, which can be seen to be symbolized by such factories as this. This television series, as much as the book Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda, can be seen as much an influence on the album Tales of Topographic Oceans. The Ascent of Man, with its desire to unify both science and art and spirituality, I believe was a great influence on this progressive rock masterpiece. Now, is it a masterpiece? This is the question. My opinion is that John Anderson, in 1973, being the ringmaster of perhaps the greatest of the 1970s progressive rock bands, wanted to attempt something that had never been done in rock and roll. And that was to create an album which unified science and art together, encapsulating all aspects of humanity from the dawn of its existence and through the widths and breadths of space and time. He was aided by this in another book, Vera Stanley Alder's book, and which was called Vera Stanley Alder's book, which was called In Visualization of the Third Eye, or I can't remember it now. Can we start again? Right, and I believe that John Anderson at this time was actually talking with Vera Stanley Alder. This book is a very interesting book because it explores the esoteric. Vera Stanley Alder had become quite well known in the 1920s and 30s and had actually created a number of fans for her work, including the great Elvis Presley, who was a hero of John Anderson. This book was seen as, for many English hippies, as being a guidebook to exploring the more metaphysical. If we look at the subject matter contained within this book and The Ascent of Man, we put all that together, I believe that we have in that a much better idea of the influences that were upon this album Tales from Topographic Oceans. If the band, yes, failed in some way of bringing this realization in sound to light, then I believe it was a worthy cause. Maybe they bit off more than they could chew with this album. And the fact that they only managed to get 60% of the way there, maybe 70% of the way there, is still a testament to the reach and vision of this incredible band. What we are going to do now is to go deeper into the actual symbolic meaning of this record, but also look at its execution structurally, and we may be able to elucidate from this whether this album's any good or not. It has, of course, since 1973 been seen as a comic failure of rock music before punk rock came and emerged, making rock what it should be, and that is something which is visceral and alive and not full of pretense. But as time has gone on, and we are now 50 years on from this album, many people think that it is a masterpiece. The jury is out. Shall we go forth and see what we can find out? On the liner notes of Tales from Topographic Oceans, John Anderson writes an explanation of the album. And this is quite famous. I can remember reading it as a young man, trying to work out what the hell this album was about. On the album, he says that the album was inspired by the book Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. And it describes that he'd read a footnote in that book that was describing a thing that comes from the Hindu texts, and it discusses the sort of 4 fields of knowledge, human knowledge, and they are collectively named the Shastras. Number 1 would be the Shruti, number 2, the Smriti, number 3, the Puranas, and last, the Tantras. And these cover certain aspects within the sort of metaphysical view of the cosmos in the Hindu religion, as transmitted to the West by Paramahansa Yogananda. Right, I'm not going to say his name again. So this has always placed this album in being this weird progressive rock album with very obscure ideas and inspiration from this very strange spiritual book. In fact, if you see early in this video with the interview with Rick Wakeman, it describes as being weird and esoteric and strange. Now, the album's definitely esoteric and strange, but what this does not really convey is what the intentions of John Anderson were on this album. I think he wanted, and this is why the album is a failure, what he wanted to do was to try and create a musical piece that acted as a unifying force, bringing together science, art and religion and human history all together onto one album. It's such an undertaking. And we could talk about all the incredible concepts and ideas that other progressive rock bands have tried to put across on their music, but I don't think anybody has ever been able to get anywhere near the scope and sheer audacity that Yes tried to pull off on this album. Now, the fact that this album went to number 1 and sold millions of copies is a testament to something which I think is quite ennobling when we look at the sort of what human beings are capable of appreciating aesthetically. It's quite incredible. But of course, many people who bought this album that have been blown away by the funky, rocky grooviness of Roundabout may have been a little bit sort of let down, perhaps. And that let down has turned into a sort of, well, slight apathy towards the album. That, of course, the music critics that from day one wanted to put the boot in progressive rock so they could champion the likes of Patti Smith and the Ramones, then jumped on as soon as they could, all pretentious, as though some working class guy from the up north in England shouldn't attempt to make a piece of art like this, especially in the area of rock and roll.
The album has 4 20-minute tracks. On side 1, we have the revealing of science of dog, the revealing of science and God, not of dog. In brackets, the Dance of Dawn, and that was written by John Anderson and Steve Howe in the initial sort of writing period of this album. It seems that Steve Howe was up for this idea. Whether the other band members were is a different argument, but this has a lot of very strong songwriting in it, albeit maybe a little bit higgledy-piggledy in its arrangement. This clocks in at 20 minutes and 23 seconds. Side 2, we have The Remembering, in brackets, High on the Memory. And this is, from a writing point of view, it's got the whole band down as writers. So we imagine that this was recorded in the studio through improvisational process, a very difficult way of creating an epic. Of course, Close to the Edge and these, incredible epics that Yes are famous for were created in that way. But there's one thing going into a recording studio to create one of those using the sort of democratic sort of improvisational approach, but to try and create 4, very difficult. Side 3 opens up with The Ancient, and this is credited again to Anderson and Howe, and also Chris Squire gets a credit as well. But again, I think this one is the Anderson and Howe writing sessions, as is the final track, which is called Ritual, in brackets Nous sommes du soleil, which is credited to Anderson and Howe. If we go back to the Vera Stanley Alder book, there are certain descriptions of the esoteric in that book that I think are very interesting. I went through a very similar thing when I was a teenager, when I discovered P.D. Ouspensky's New Model of the Universe book, and the first chapter of that describes the esoteric. And he outlined a sort of way of thinking that was actually came into fashion at the beginning of the 20th century, and it was this idea that secret knowledge had been hidden within books around us, that we could read the Bible literally, or we could see that there was very specific esoteric information in these books that were sort of the domain of the initiated, and that we could now, in the 20th century, explore these and pull out the knowledge that it was within there. A lot of this relates to the Orphic traditions of Pythagoras and his followers, and is usually manifest in a sort of number cult. And with numbers, that relates to all sorts of things, often to music. This is a thing that I became very interested in after reading P.D. Ouspensky's book, which took me to Gurdjieff, and realised that this sort of secret knowledge that he was just discussing was this idea of the law of 3 and the law of 7. The law of 3 being like a triad in music, and the law of 7 being like an octave. And the octave, or the ray of creation, as Gurdjieff would put it, was basically could be used to look at the ascendancy of, say, the elements within the cosmos, or, say, biological elements like animals. This was a sort of what was called the ray of creation, with this idea that everything in the universe is an upward ascending scale. Now, in the older book, and I downloaded it and I've had a read of it, and I've tried to pull out as much as I can. In the ray of creation, we have this idea that you have the microscopic, you have the macroscopic, with human beings in the middle. There is an order that goes from sort of subatomic particles out to the whole cosmos as a whole, and that is sort of a spatial idea of the cosmos. We also have a time-based idea, which is the Big Bang in science, which again starts off with these tiny little particles and explodes out into all the wonder. And what does this explode out into? It explodes out into our consciousness, doesn't it? I think, therefore I am. So this is the area, I think, that Tales from Topographic Oceans is trying to deal with. And it's trying to do something with which Alder did in her book, which has pulled together the ideas in science with these esoteric New Age ideas. And I think the presentation of it was greatly influenced by The Ascent of Man by Bronowski, which also was a huge influence on me. There was like 3 TV series throughout the 70s that completely changed me as a person. One was The Ascent of Man, one was Life on Earth, David Attenborough, and the other was The Cosmos, Carl Sagan. I think if you take those 3 TV series and then look what I do on this YouTube channel, it is just a rubbish version of that based around progressive rock and jazz rock fusion. I've cornered the market in that, I really have. So going back into the older book, what we have is this idea of eternal recurrence, of repetition, and the microcosm and the macrocosm. That very thing I just discussed is in the book, right? This is often personified in the esoteric saying, as above, so below, or, as William Blake put it, to be able to see the world in a grain of sand. That if we just examine the tiniest thing, within there is the knowledge of the whole universe. Now, this is a very interesting thing that at the end of this video I will touch on again once I've gone through my very esoteric reading of this album. Alda was interested in evolution and looking at evolution, which in her time in the 1920s and 30s was a much newer theory and had completely radically changed Western culture, sort of arguing against the sort of Christian exoteric view of the world and opening up people to a much more esoteric view of the world, which in the UK came through the Theosophic Society with Madame Blavatsky. This is the world we are in. Evolution is seen from an esoteric point of view of being an ascension to a perfect whole. Within this cycle of eternal recurrence, you know, animals live and die, and they are part of this huge ascension to this perfect whole. We have the idea of cause and effect, or karma. Karma and rebirth, thesis and antithesis, the dialectic, the law of 3. That is a part of her thinking, and as anyone watches this channel, it has influenced my thinking. Now, do I think these things exist out in a material, classical view of the world? No, because I think that in itself is a certain view of the world. I think these are aesthetic ways of seeing the world, but that is a completely different video. But my point is here is what Yes and John Anderson are trying to do on this album is within this realm. And that is very interesting to me, that they have tried to do this. In the older book, she talks about the plan of creation, or the 7 planes, which relates to the law of 7, the law of the octave. Now I'm going to, I think this is a quote from Alda. I've got it from the book anyway, I hope it is. But this really does explain Alda's views of the world. And then I think once I read this, it might give you a better idea of what Tales from Topographic Oceans is about. From the plane of creation, we have order of vibration with sound above form. By studying such theories, we can realize the intimate connection between sound and all other expressions of life. Sound is low down on the scale and comes just above form. Therefore, sound as the intermediary between the abstract idea and the concrete form. Sounds mold the ether into shapes, and through these shapes, the corresponding power is able to play and makes its impression on the physical matter. So she's taken scientific principles of basically a vibration. She's saying that we have the vibrations of the particles that make our form. Then we have sound at this point. Then we've got light. Then we've got heat. You know, and there's a sort of an ascendancy of vibration. And sound can be seen as being the intermediary between physical form and this sort of much more higher level of vibration. Now, of course, this is not entirely scientific, but what it is interesting to me is the aesthetic idea that when you deal with music, there is a plane between us in the physical world and something bigger than us outside, which I think aesthetically is the case. And this, I think, is the central idea of what John Anderson wanted to get across, was using music to unify this view, metaphysical view of the, you know, time and space, I suppose. The first track on the album. So we are now going to look at, and I'm clocking in at 20 minutes and 23 seconds, the revealing science of God, Dance of the Dawn. this one, ostensibly using the older, the very slightly older interpretation, is looking at revelation. It's looking at how the gods transmit their knowledge to enlightened beings. It's about the way the universe works and its transmission to enlightened beings, I suppose. But it also relates to science. In this track, it is trying to put the idea that it is science is a part of humans' ability to understand the mind of God, if you see what I mean. It's that idea. Now, this track opens up with one of the most successful things on the album, where I feel that this album is actually delivering what it's trying to say. It opens up with the sort of sounds of nature and these voices, and the voices come in and they're monotonous and they're repetitive, and through the repetition we feel this like opening up like the flower. We feel the evolution of the universe, the evolution of our planet, and the evolution of species, all in the sort of realm of evolutionary science. When I listen to it, you can almost see the animals coming out of the sea onto the land, their voices intertwining, representing the development of all things. Okay, as this building comes together, we feel the album's coming together. So the album starts up a little bit like we imagine everything to start up. This is a big play, isn't it? From Yes. As it moves up, it builds into the first of one of the songs, and there's many song fragments in this opening track. Many song fragments. I get the feeling in this writing session where John Anderson sat down with Steve Howe, they outlined not some bizarre progressive rock stuff, but some very beautiful, simple, singable melodies. And we get the first of these, which are on this track are almost Beatlesque. And this is one of the things I want to get across about Tales from Topographic Oceans. There's a ton of incredible tunes on here. If you isolate them, they're actually more catchy than a lot of the stuff they've done before. But they're embedded in stuff which is actually very difficult. Now, that's a good thing to go with. But I feel that on this first track, there's such an abundance of ideas that once this track was finished, they had less ideas to go with the rest of the tracks on this album. I think they may have had to go in the studio for 3 years to create something like this, especially in the studios as they were then, with probably a 24-track, recorder, limited time, spending a lot of money. And that holds this album back for me. Plus this idea that I think Steve Howe is on side with John Anderson. Rick Wakeman obviously isn't. He doesn't like this approach. And I think what he reacted to was this idea that was happening in music then, where the progressive thing had happened and they'd looked around, and now the fusion thing's happening and people listen to the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Steve Howe discusses the fact he was listening to Frank Zappa and these long guitar solos. And I think they wanted to bring a more sort of open-ended improvisational approach in. And I think this was hampered by Rick Wakeman, who didn't want to do it. Once he went and Patrick Moraz came in, who had much more of a jazz fusion sensibility, they go to town on it with Relaya, and they do it more successfully. So you feel that maybe Rick Wakeman's holding them back. Alan White as well is the new drummer, and I feel where Bruford would have also been a stick in the mud, feeling like a founder member of Yes, Alan White does what he's told. Chris Squire, his involvement is in the middle of those two things. Steve Howe and John Anderson, they're all over this. So we go into this sort of very strong melodies, and we have these lyrics. The lyrics lament the loss of knowledge. This is this idea that human beings once had knowledge, it's lost. And it slowly builds up and it moves into this faster chanted vocal with sort of a tom-tom beats, and then suddenly it drops. Now, this is one of the things with Tales from Topographic Oceans. Their epics before, if we look at Close to the Edge or even And You and I, had a lot more successful moving through different musical passages. Here, we basically have the emergency turn, and then suddenly it drops into this jazzy interlude, and then we go into another new song, another great chorus describing destroying the environment and looking at warfare. So it's looking at all the bad stuff that human beings have evolved to do. it then returns to this sort of chanting tom-tom section. This starts to build, and we have some really amazing guitar playing from Steve Howe. And then it drops down again into this new finger-picked theme. And it sounds like there's a flute being played. Now, this could well be a mellotron flute, perhaps, but it really sounds like a flute. I had to look to see if anyone plays flute. There's no, evidence that flute was played. Very, very beautiful. All these little bits are very, very beautiful. We have a structure where there's these beautiful melodies, and then it drops down to sort of an interlude. Beautiful melodies drops down to an interlude. Again, it starts to build, and we go onto the rhythm section. And this keyboard sound comes in from Rick Wakeman. It's like one of the few times Rick Wakeman seems to wake up. Rick Wakeman! And he wakes up and he comes in and he does some incredible playing. He's got this sort of keyboard sound at this point that sounds like the theme to the Rockford Files. And it does remind me of the Rockford Files at this point. Anyway, this slowly develops into a lovely wordless section, then into Rick Wakeman's keyboard section. And my notes here says, for the first time, it really rocks. But it quickly drops to moves fast, it tells me, that bit, which builds up again. And they start reiterating all the previous melodies in a majestic fashion before returning to the creation chanting from the start. And that ending, where they sort of reiterate everything, pulls this side one together. It's meandery. It is in no way a terrible track. The individual sections are incredible. But I think the real problem with Tales from Topographic Oceans is this does not rock till nearly the end of the track. You've got to go for 15 minutes before you hear that rocking sound. There's too much fiddling about, and this is the problem. If I was to score this track relative to Close to the Edge, which would say Close to the Edge is 10 out of 10, say Gates of Delirium is 10 out of 10, Awaken is 10 out of 10, where would I put this? Well, I would probably put it at 7 out of 10. Now, I would love to do a track which is at 7 out of 10 in relative to Close to the Edge. This is not a failure by any means. As an opener, they've established it. And you may say, well, that's the opener. We've got 3 of these to go. You don't want to deliver Close to the Edge on the first one. So what's going to happen next? So we move on to the second side, which is called, just get these titles right because they're quite wordy. The Remembering, High on the Memory. If I then look at what this one's about related to my sort of new interpretation of this album, once that knowledge has been transmitted from the gods to the enlightened beings then store this esoteric knowledge in certain devices, which then transmit the knowledge on an esoteric level through time. So human beings can go back to this. I'll give you an example of how this would work. It could be said that the triad and the octave in music is an esoteric storing of certain mathematical information. The tarot, for example, is another example. The tarot cards relate to the pack of cards. When you buy a pack of cards, you still get the Joker in there. The Joker's still retained as a nod to the fact that the cards used to have all these different tarot cards in there. But taking the cards as a whole, again, we have a mathematical system that you can lay out on the floor. And I have read in certain New Age books that the playing cards are a store of esoteric information in a form that they would know would survive because it would be used to gamble. So this is the idea of how esoteric knowledge is stored, right? So this is about the transmission of knowledge through the ages. It starts off much closer to an English aesthetic. We have a sort of penny whistle opening sound. It's very folky. We move into a guitar and vocal section. And the lyrics are about traveling through time and space. It's very melodic. We got no drums. So this really does sound like the raw stuff, I imagine, that Steve Howe and John Anderson had come up with in their rehearsals and writing sessions with very little adornment. The this moves up slowly, and there's that point where John Anderson says, "And I do think very well." And then it goes into an ascending waltz with repeated phrases. There's melodic guitar trills. This lasts for about 5 minutes. Nothing's really happened in this first 5 minutes, but we're all twiddling around on this guitar stuff. Very nice, very pretty. After this fiddling around, it returns back to the guitar, vocal, and melodies. At this point, the tom-tom comes in again. There's a lot of this, something that Bill Bruford would not have done, I don't think. There's a lot of just tom-tom filling on this album. The tom-toms enter, they lift it slightly. There's more mellotron, there's guitar trilling, and then there's a mellotron and a Moog melody. All this is very noodly, right? At this point, we then go into a 6/8 section with actual drums. This is 10 minutes in. We've gone for 10 minutes with no drums, no rock and roll, no kicking. This is 10 minutes of just noodling, right? But as soon as the drums are in, it drops down very quickly, and it then moves into a section which I call the relayer section, where this is where he sings about the relayer, and the relayer is obviously the thing that relays this information. Of course, it becomes the name of the following album. So this starts to kick in, and maybe some hope we're going to rock in a good yes rock way, but no, it drops down again. This track will not get out of first gear. Now, as a kid, when I bought this album, I plowed my way through the first track, and that I can remember that keyboard solo at the end that Rick did. That was like, oh, I love this. This is brilliant. And I really loved it. You know, I thought that's great. Thinking that this album's going to open up, then put side 2 on, and it was side 2 that did my head in. This is just so noodly, right? And if you look at the actual composition material of side 2 compared to side 1, there's a lot less stuff. It is as though they are trying to take a certain amount of material and spread it out as far as they can. It's not the usual yes sort of track where you feel like it's an actual overabundance material, and they're having to use Rick Wakeman and Steve Howe's incredible arrangement skills to put all these different ideas into an epic. You feel like they're spreading it out, not on the first track, but on this one, without a doubt. There's lots of guitar trilling. There's lots of held chords and Steve Howe trilling throughout this album. It's like the default place that they go. It eventually moves up to They Move Fast chorus. Beautiful tune. You're like one of Yes's great melodies. There's so many great melodies on this album. And it builds up to quite a rousing ending, but it doesn't quite deliver. And then after this ending, it ends with some more trilling. And you're like, oh, yeah, we've had enough trilling. So if I was going to score this one relative to Close to the Edge, I would be coming in at 5 out of 10. It then moves on to The Ancient. And this one actually looks at the esoteric material itself. This is discussing the myths of creation. We are looking into the depth of it now. After looking at this, the way human beings have framed this, we are now going straight to the esoteric heart. Now, the shame with this is this one, I feel they lift their game in a way. And, well, let's get into it, because I think the trouble with this one is there's a lot of Yes fans who don't like this one so much. It's less Yes-like. It's much more avant-garde and weird. So we're going back to this ancient knowledge. We're going to look at the esoteric itself. It's like being initiated into a certain space. And the sound moves from that sort of English aesthetic Yes world to... I'm almost like transmitted to Tibet or transported to Tibet. We have a gong, we have this Tibetan percussion, and then suddenly we have this really exciting marimba and bass riff comes in. For me, when this kicks in, it's the best thing so far on Tales from Topographic Oceans. It's not quite what I'd expect from Yes, but I absolutely love it. This is amazing. It's angular, it's tense. It moves around on this riff, and then it modulates up to the 4 chord, which is giving it a more rootsier, bluesier sound. And then suddenly 3 big crashes, and we're back to the mellotron cooing. Orchestral stabs. All this is very Yes at this point. I love this bit here. Really exciting. At 4 minutes, the vocals enter, and it drops into a march. Staccato chord stabs, back to the march, repeat the staccato chord stabs, and then we jump into another 6/8 section. Few modulations of that 6/8 section, and we're back to the chanting. This seems a lot more tighter in its compositional approach, a lot more tighter. And then at this point, when we've been drawn in, it goes into this angular, jerky rhythm, proper prog, and we get an actual drum beat. This is all exciting stuff, and then it goes into another 6/8 section. They repeat that whole section again. It's all very busy. It's all very atonal. They then go back to the march, but it's much more minimal this time. The angular rhythm enters, and over the top of this texture, we have this incredible abstract guitar playing, and it's an incredible atonal abstract solo, and something that Steve Howe at this point, I don't think was that known for. The shadow of King Crimson hangs over this track. Now, we have to mention at this point that one of the big inspirations for this album was actually Jamie Muir, who was the percussionist with King Crimson in the Bill Bruford version of King Crimson that recorded Lark's Tongues in Aspic. And Jamie Muir was almost like a monk. I think he did go on to become a monk after he left progressive rock in the mid-70s. I'm not too sure there. But he has a conversation with John Anderson at Bill Bruford's wedding. And so this is very interesting here because Bill Bruford's gone, they got Alan White in, but they're moving towards areas which are much more associated with King Crimson at this point. Steve Howe's soloing is incredible here. And it actually drops into, at one point, like this diminished section. Diminished is where you get stacked minor thirds. It's a very King Crimson-y sound. I will give you an example of that with this guitar. That's all I have to do. I hope you can hear this. That's a diminished triad there. I hope you can hear that. A very angular, almost beyond minor. Whoops. Oh. Where are we? And then, after all this chaotic jamming, I love this. This first half of The Ancient I absolutely love. It drops into sort of classical guitar part, which sounds very much like Mood for a Day, and then we get a vocal. In fact, I believe if you really listen to the acoustic guitar part here that Steve Howe is finger picking, we have bits of Roundabout and Mood for a Day in. There is stuff that has definitely been reused on this album from the Fragile sessions. Again, it's this idea that they're having to try and take these ideas. Normally, on a Yes album, that would be fleshed out, but what we get is just that. This is a way of filling up space, you know, play a bit, reuse a bit of Mood for a Day, finger pick it, and we'll have that bit of vocal. But very beautiful, you know, very beautiful play from Steve Howe. John Anderson enters with some slight keyboards being added. I don't really feel that Rick Wakeman's had much to do with this one at all. And then we have another beautiful melody from John Anderson. It's the bit where he sings, "Does the lamb cry out before we shoot it dead?" Which is a bit of a shock to hear that lyric. I never shoot a lamb dead. Maybe it's some sort of esoteric reference to Lamb Lies Down on Broadway by Genesis, but of course it can't because this is 1973 and that hadn't been made yet. But it'd been funny if it had. We get the repeat of the classical guitar piece again, and I again start to feel they're stretching the material out. Suddenly it jumps again. We get this crash into this strange Greek type melody, into the stabs again. All this is very disjointed. It's not close to the edge, but it's fun and it's energetic. I would have said that it's not quite at the level of the Revealing of Science and God opener, but not far off. I've scored this at a 6 out of 10. We then go on to the final track, which is called Ritual. Now, I think in terms of these tracks, this is the one I think that perhaps Yes played the most live. I know it appears on Yes shows. This is the first time I heard anything off this album was when I heard Ritual. Yes shows contained a full version of Gates of Delirium that blew me away, and then Ritual, which they split across two sides, didn't blow me away. So when I approached at this point, knowing that we were going to finish with Ritual, I was a little bit like, oh God, you know. So this could be described, I think, you know, as looking at the rituals that human beings use to enact these ideas that have gone on before. So this is looking at our life, you know, all the things we do, you know, going to school, going to work, going to church, you know, gardening, whatever it is that we do, going fishing, all the rituals that exist, I suppose. And it explores this idea of the mind, the body, and the soul. And here we have the law of three, or one of the embodiments of that, and how that relates, and how these rituals sort of nourish us, I suppose, or maybe don't nourish us. And it tries to unify us as human beings with this idea that the giants under the sun that we've just encountered, these huge chaotic entities that we've encountered in this ancient wisdom, we are now going to realise that we are from that. And that's the big payoff of this track, is the Nous sommes du soleil that ends this We Are of the Sun. Starts off with more stabbage. There's a lot of stabbage on this album. Now, one of the things I noticed when this track comes in is the drums kick in and the drums are thin. Now, the drums are also thin on the opening track. It's as though there's two different drum sounds at play here. And although Ritual and Revelation, or Revealing Silence of God, these two are the stronger tracks, I don't think the mix is as strong. And this sort of diminishes the album for me. I know Stephen Wilson has remixed it. I'm pretty sure I went back and had a listen to those. But the drums sound so boxy at this point. This could just be me. I'm just throwing it out there. At this point, there's more trilling, and I think within the studio, Steve Howar's doing a lot more just trilling and doing the same guitar solo, and I think they turn around and say, can you not do a solo, could you do something else? So he reiterates all the themes that we've had up to that point, which does serve it is a way of bringing all these things together. But I'm not a fan of the trilling, right? Anyway, drums eventually kick in. And this is the thing that's missing. I think this is why this elevates Ritual, because pretty quick they get to a drum groove, it kicks in, there's a 5/4 section, and it rocks. We're back into Yes territory. There's some stabs, there's some vocal and bass melodies running together. You know, like it's very exciting, great, proper Yes. Just, oh, we're here now, he's going to deliver it. We've had this stuff at them. We're going to deliver it, aren't you? No, it drops down to more trillaging. Then we go into the Nous sommes du soleil section, and it sounds so thin. Incredible, brilliant bit of, well, could be one of Yes's greatest melodies. It's almost Beatlesque in its approach. This is the Beatles' sort of songwriting approach is all over this album. And this starts to build. This is a very successful part of this album. And we eventually go back to the stabbage at the beginning. Then we hear a whistle. Now, you know these car crash changes that they use? I mean, where on Close to the Edge or Fragile would you have a whistle? Like, how are we going to get from one track, one section to the next? I don't know, just blow a whistle like it's like what, like half time? Yeah, blap, and they blow this whistle and then heads down and we're into a bass solo. Chris Squire's going to get his moment. Now, we love Chris Squire. This is Chris Squire's moment. If you want to hear what Chris Squire's all about, go and listen to this here. It's very exciting, but it's messy and chaotic. I think it's this messy chaoticness that Rick Wakeman didn't like. We go into a guitar solo again, and again, I feel like they are stretching this stuff out with improvisation. And then, what could be worse than a bass solo? Yes, a drum solo. And it goes into a drum solo. But actually, this drum solo works. I think it's actually Alan White on drums, John Anderson is on drums, and then there's maybe Chris Squire is on percussion. Steve Howe apparently was playing some drums, but he felt it affected his guitar playing. Anyway, I actually think this is really, really brilliant bit. You know, there's so many drum solos on albums at this point in time in the early 70s. This has got to be one of the great moments for a drum solo. And, you know, for Alan White, first Yes album, here he comes out and he gets a drum solo. Love it. This carries on. The drums and the moog now start reiterating the melody. So they're pulling it all together. I love that. You know, all that bit that's between this sort of like almost like ring modulated sound and the drum sounds brilliant. Reminds me a little bit of Bonzo's Montreux by Led Zeppelin that they recorded it back in 1976, I think, in Montreux. We get another guitar loop, and then it chunks back into the Nous sommes du soleil, but this time they build with lots of key changes. Now, this is the end of the album. We go through a number of key changes, and then before you know it, the album is over. It's a rubbish ending. Again, I have scored this one 6 out of 10. I got to be honest, the overall score for this album, I'm going to be a bit, you know, it's 6 out of 10. This is a 6 out of 10 album. If Close to the Edge is a 10 out of 10 album, this is a 6 out of 10 album. And I've tried to be here as objective as I can. I love Yes. I wanted to show that this album was the lost masterpiece, and everyone's right, it is actually brilliant. I don't think it is, but I also don't think it's terrible. I think it is in the bracket of good. Now, I think it is at once done in by the scope of the ideas that they wanted to try and get across here, but also it is such an incredible attempt to put these ideas across that they are going to fail, and they fail a lot less than a lot of other people would trying to do what they do on this album. Now, I'm going to finish now with a very strange coda to this video, which has been a very strange video. So now let's go to the Tales from Topographic Oceans coda. You still here? Right. The thing that I find very powerful about this album is they try to do something which is almost impossible. They try to bring together this idea of science and spirituality. They try and bring those two things together. When I go back to the Ascent of Man, Bronowski, who is a mathematician who's gone on to then study evolution and makes this piece of art called The Ascent of Man, who was himself a poet, very successfully brings these two things together. And the reason why The Ascent of Man works is because in bringing these two things together and combining the sort of head and the heart, you know, bringing the Dionysian and the Apollonian together, it's describes the sublime, which I think is what art does. This is why The Ascent of Man is one of the great TV shows. Now, in that, the most famous sequence, and probably the greatest sequence in television history, is where Bronowski, who was Jewish himself, born in Poland in the early parts of the 20th century, who had moved to Germany, I think, in the around 2013, something like, 1913, 1911, somewhere like that, and then eventually ends up in England and becomes an Anglophile. Bronowski is the embodiment of that intellectual Jewish element that was forced out of Eastern Europe by the Nazis. Many of the philosophers then went to America and set up the Frankfurt School. Bronowski, however, arrives in the UK in 1920. At this point, he's 14 years old. And he takes on the English aesthetic, which includes this idea of English philosophy. English philosophy is counter to the Hegelian idea that then runs through Marx, runs through the sort of existentialists, and then ends up with the Frankfurt School. He has a philosophy which is much more rooted in science, but he has a unique way of exploring the aesthetic ideas. And I think when I think about what I try and do on this channel, and my idea of going, I could talk about fairies, I could talk about Jesus, I could talk about God, I could talk about wizards and witches, I could talk about the law of three and the law of seven, because I'm talking in an aesthetic realm. And the aesthetic realm is one half of the telescope. We can see the world from God's point of view and take on the role of God, which is what the scientist tries to do. But what the scientist can never do is take on the subjective, which is the viewpoint of the human being in the center of the universe, in which the whole universe is contained within their consciousness. There we have the mind-body problem. There we have the dialectic. There we have the thesis and antithesis, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. All these things. That is what I think the dialectic is pointing to. It's pointing to this idea of us being a double hemisphered being who once lives in a time-based world and in a spatial-based world, has to deal with reward and threat. Okay, and what we have is the numbers. Bronowski's a mathematician, but he's able, with the ascent of man, to traverse across these different areas absolutely brilliantly. This is what I think John Anderson and Yes are trying to do on this album, and I commend it because for me, this is the heart of what art does. It's right at the heart of it. Do they pull it off? No. The reason is because I don't get the feeling from this album that I get when I go back to The Ascent of Man. There is a scene, as I was saying, in The Ascent of Man, which is probably the greatest scene in television history, where him as a Jew returns to Poland and he returns to Auschwitz. And in walking around Auschwitz, and you get very sort of close-up views of inmates, you get views of the glasses, of the hair, of the ovens. And at one point, he focuses on this photograph that's in there of one of the victims of the concentration camp, and it just zooms into the eyes, and you look into the eyes and you realize this person is suffering. But the reason why the Nazis didn't care was because they had reduced human beings to numbers. Literally tattooed onto their wrist the number, which enabled them to kill 6 million people. And these people that they killed were the relatives and friends of Bronowski's family. And in an unscripted moment where he's describing this and just saying how dogma, how ideology has caused this, how human beings thinking they know, they have an absolute morality which they are sure of, as what's created this. And at this point he walks into the pits where the ashes of the Jews were poured, and he puts his hands down into the mud of that and he pulls it up, and the image freezes at that point. One of the most powerful points in television, a scene that I saw as a young man that has made me rail against dogma and ideology since then. Numbers. We are not numbers. Now, recently, within the realm of science, there has been intimations that human consciousness, which cannot be described by science, right, could well relate to quantum physics, to the macrocosm and the microcosm. Remember, we mentioned this, and this is contained in the opening of this album, the macrocosm and the microcosm. And earlier on in this video, you heard the voice of a scientist who was describing the way our cells, our very cells in our body, contain everything about that body. All right? That if we go into there, the arrangement of the chemicals, the arrangement of the physical qualities of that, which we tend to analyze from a materialist point of view, but the material analysis of these cells does not describe what is in there. And the very fact that our very being, the being that these cells make up, is echoed inside that. And the reason is because those cells relate to the quantum field. And the quantum field creates numbers. So the mathematical use of numbers by human beings to map their sort of material world is actually inaccurate, because consciousness is creating numbers, and numbers and consciousness are being created by the quantum field, by the very thing that creates being itself. And the point he makes is that we cannot be reduced to numbers, and that if we look at a computer, if we look at AI and we reduce it right down to what the components of that cell is, we come down to the tiny switch that is within the cell. Sorry, which is within the circuit board, which is in the microchip. From a materialistic point of view, when we look at that, it can only ever be 0 or 1. And from that, AI intelligence is based. But human being is based upon the quantum field. And when we go into the quantum field, what we have is Schrödinger's cow, as I have called it. This is the point that when we look at a particle, depending on our consciousness, it could be on or off. It is both and neither all at the same time. And that is the difference between us as beings. So in other words, our consciousness, which is created by the quantum field, is not contained within our material self. Our material self is contained within our consciousness. And in that, I think, you see the scientific marriage between the idea of the material world of science, of logic, of reason, of number, and the aesthetic world of consciousness and being. Those two things are being brought together in this realm which brings together science and metaphysics at once. And this is very, very interesting. Now, what I find surprising is that in researching this video, at one point I was sat there working and this video just came on and I ended up watching it. It's blown me away. And I thought, I'm going to embed into this video the idea of this external consciousness that we all have. The idea that our body is the goggles that you put on when you send the drone out. And as you can see, I'm pretty confused at this point as well. As I get to this, I think I have tried my best on this video. I've tried my best to do what Tales of Topographic Open tries to do. And I think fails. I think I failed. But isn't it worthwhile trying and failing? I have tried to create a video that proves what? I don't know. Try and bring, the material and the metaphysical together. Try and bring the mind and body together. Try and do the same thing John Anderson did. Right? I find that the things that make that possible for me are two things. Is one, is being able to put out there the fact that you don't know what the hell you're talking about. You don't know what the hell's going on. And B, do it with a sense of humour. Because when we laugh, we embody the dichotomy of existence. End of the video. If you like this video, please put a like on it. If you want to see more stuff like this, I don't want to do more stuff like this, please subscribe. I've got a Patreon, the links are down below. I've got a Substack, the links are down below. I have got a Bandcamp, and you can be subscribed to these. You can pay money, you can become free members, you can do whatever you want, but please get involved if you want more of this mad stuff that I am doing here. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I am just going to now return to Professor Dr. Andrew Edwards to finish this video off as only he can. Thank you for watching.